to propel this eschatology. And these people we can call agents, okay? Agents. And these agents, of course, include Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. Okay? And this is how the world works, where the occultists are the ones who imagine the world, and the rich and powerful are the ones who act out the world in order to benefit themselves. And then they appoint certain agents who are like puppets in order to move the world in a certain direction. Okay? So these agents are like vectors. All right. But there's certain problems with this system. The first problem is that there are different secret societies, and they fight amongst themselves to achieve different eschatologies, okay? The other problem is that the rich and powerful will often switch secret societies, switch loyalties in order to maximize their benefit. So they don't have any loyalties, right? And then the last problem is that these agents, like Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, they seem like puppets, but they themselves believe they are using these secret societies to achieve their own vision, which is given to them by God. Okay? So it's a very complicated system. And this is why no one thinks that it's all a grand conspiracy, because each person is doing his or her own part subconsciously to maximize his or her benefit. Okay? So it's not a top-down system. It's a much more dynamic, fluid game than people assume. Okay? So this is a map that helps us understand how the world works. And this is why I'm able to figure out what's happening in the Middle East. Because if you're able to focus on the story, okay, the story here, you basically know where people are going, even though you may not be aware of what the different secret societies are doing and how the different agents are thinking. Okay? As long as you're able to figure out the occultists, how they're thinking, you're able to figure out the story that they want to tell the world, you can basically figure out the general direction of the world in the long term. Okay? All right. So now what I want to talk about is China. What is China and what is China going to do? All right. So again, let's go back to our theory of how the world works, of how the world is structured. You have the empire, and then from the empire, you have the game masters. Okay, the people in finance. Then they create the global economy. Then this creates the rule space, international order. And then you have the education system, media, and culture in order to indoctrinate people to believe in this system, that this system is fair, right, and natural. Okay, and then you have parasitic organizations, science, crime, intelligence, to control the system, but also to draw benefit, to extract value from the system. Now, what we need to understand is that the beauty of the system is that it is capable of extending itself and replicating itself in other societies, okay? So the two examples are the GCC and China. Okay, this is really important for us to appreciate. China is not a civilization. China is not a nation state. China is a construct of empire, okay? What the system has done is basically taken all its elements and embedded itself into China to create a vassal state, okay? Or you can also say a mirage. And then you're like, okay, well, what does that mean? Well, just think of the GCC, where before the empire, the GCC was just a desert. And the empire, the system, takes the GCC and turns it into this seemingly vibrant, cosmopolitan, wealthy center. And then they bring in the universities, right, like Georgetown NYU. They bring in culture. They bring in the media ecosystem. So this system replicates itself into the GCC as well as China. Now this is important because the moment that this system is under strain, okay, for example, Iran attacks it, we see it's all just a mirage. This system is not sustainable. It collapses onto itself because it doesn't have a civilization. It doesn't have an existing soul, okay? It's all just appearance. And what I believe is that China is in a very similar situation. That's why China was allowed to join WTO. That's why so many Chinese students go overseas to become educated, okay? To create this mirage that China is this modern, flourishing economy. So this is China's relationship to the world. So rather than believe that China is competitor to the system, we need to appreciate that China is really an extension of the system. So if this system comes under strain, China itself comes under strain. That's why China is so desperate, so anxious to see peace in the Middle East again. Okay? So there are rumors, there's news reporting that China has exerted pressure on Iran to negotiate a ceasefire. Because if the global economy collapses, China is in a lot of trouble. All right? Okay. Okay, so what are long-term implications of the Hollywood-Pentagon complex? Okay, and the answer is, if you go back to the system, okay, no one actually knows what's going on. But they believe they know what's going on, and they believe they're individual parts of the story, okay? So if you're in culture, you think you're the ones in control, and you're the ones dictating policy. If you're in the media, you think you're the ones in control. If you're in education, you think you're in control, okay? So everyone just basically lives in his own bubble, in his own fantasy world, without being able to see the bigger picture. And that's why we don't have control and agency and free will over how the system will turn out. Okay? And we cannot, because it's actually very difficult for us to really appreciate how the system works. It's much easier for us to believe in our fantasies because it allows us to work with our friends and our colleagues much easier. Okay? It's much easier for people to live in his own bubble and to be delusional than it is for the person to be objective. Okay? So the Hollywood-Pentagon complex, it is not just unique to America, it is true for everyone. How do emerging powers like China factor in the predicted shifts in global order? I already told you that all these things that you believe are alternatives, including digital currency, renewables, China, they're all just projections, extensions of the system. The system is under strain, these are under strain as well. Okay? What strategies can individuals employ to navigate potential global economic instability and resource scarcity? Okay, so the problem is that individuals by themselves cannot navigate change. Individuals need to enter into communities, okay? So if you really want to survive the change, well, first of all, you need to educate yourself as to what's going on. And that's why I teach these classes, to give you the bigger picture as to how the world works and where things are going. But you also need to make a commitment to reach out to other people, become their friends, be generous and open with them, share with them, and build a community. Okay? Also, one thing that I would recommend is maybe starting a family. And the reason, and you're like, okay, wait a minute here. This is silly because you have said for the longest time, the world is collapsing. This is the end of the world. Why would you have children? And the answer is because, first of all, death doesn't matter. Destruction doesn't really matter. What matters is our ability in this world to live a creative, purposeful, significant life. Okay? That's why we're here. It's not to make $1 million. It's not to eat a lot of food. It's to have the best experience possible, to extend the imagination of the universe. And what I found having children, I have 3 kids, is that I live every day with tremendous energy and purpose Because I'm here not to become famous or to make a lot of money. I'm here to make sure that my kids are happy and healthy. And that's why I get up in the morning and work very hard. Okay, and I don't really care about the world. All I care about is, are my kids happy and healthy? So children and family give you a energy, a purpose, a meaning that drives you to greater creative heights, okay? All right. What are the primary drivers behind specific geopolitical actions, and how do these motivations interact with a game theory? Okay, all right. So again, this is a really important theory to understand, where the occultists are the main drivers. Why? Because the occultists, whether it be poets or prophets, they're the ones who imagine the world we live in. Okay? And others can only work within the boundaries of this imagination. So yes, the rich and the powerful, they have all the money and all the wealth, but they don't have an imagination. So, and ultimately, your actions have to be driven by your thoughts. And it's these occultists, okay, who drive your thoughts, who control your thoughts. So we just live in the world imagined by occultists. Who they are, what they want, how they work is something that we'll discuss after the break, okay? After today, we're going on a 1-week break for the midterms, and then we'll come back. We'll talk more about these people, the occultists, okay? They're very important people to talk about. All right, so let's move on. Okay, now I want to look at some individual questions. All right, so this is Joyce Lay from Substack. She's a founding member, so thank you, Joyce, for your generosity. Okay, she asked this question. You make 3 predictions about the outcome of the US-Iran war, but I don't have any time frames. Yeah, I don't do time frames because these things are trends, okay? They're general movements. Okay, and she says, well, if all 3 come true then we have to believe that it may not be because of the war itself. How do you differentiate between causation and correlation, okay? This is a great question, and it's something that I think a lot about. So I make these predictions in order to validate my prediction model. But just because these predictions turn out to be correct does not validate my prediction model 100%, okay? And that's why it's important to keep an open mind and to continue to make predictions. Now, what I will say is this. When I first started making predictions 2 years ago, I was just looking at patterns and then trying to figure out what patterns were the most salient or the most obvious. And then I made those predictions, and I was fairly confident about these predictions. Now that I'm famous, now that people are demanding I make predictions every day, it's hard for me to make accurate predictions because I don't have access to all the information. And it's hard for me to think clearly, objectively, because I know that whatever I say is going to have an impact on global events, okay? So this is a major constraint on my capacity to make accurate predictions. I am no longer an observer, I'm a player, okay? And I also get a lot of influence from other people who want to control my predictions. I understand that. So I try to keep away from people as much as possible, but it's an impossible thing. So I appreciate this question. Yes, correlation and causation are 2 different things altogether. It's possible that we'll never really understand causation. The other thing that I want to emphasize is that I myself appreciate the limitations to my own objectivity, okay, because of my status today. Okay, so that's from Joyce. Isn't Pump and every politician just a puppet of the societies? This is a great question. It's something that I addressed earlier.